And now we'd like to share with you a talk on Thelemic Values and the Wisdom of the Body, which was given in the San Francisco Bay Area by Speech in the Silence co-producer IAO131.
Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love and your will.
This is called Thelemic Ethics, which is not the title I chose. It was something like Thelemic Values and the Wisdom of the Body, but apparently that is too long for a Facebook event. So that's that. So most people are familiar, I hope, with the 10 Commandments that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, the 10 thou shalts and thou shalt nots. That system is pretty much a perfect symbol of what I call old morality. Old morality is essentially consists in a belief that there's an absolute law of conduct, often rewarded by heaven or punishment in hell or good karma and bad karma or whatever else. The notion of old morality is especially apparent in the Jewish religion with its 10 commandments, and actually there's 613 commandments in Judaism. But virtually every religion and philosophy has a codified set of ethics. Their do's and their don'ts. There's even these in Eastern systems to some extent. Yama and niyama in yoga, the precepts of Buddhism, for example. It's arguable how much they view these as absolute, but they are written as you should do this and you should not do that. So, old morality, by definition, being an absolute set of moral conduct, set of ethics of moral conduct, it's necessarily inflexible. You have to do this and you cannot do that. Moses didn't just invoke God as a source and authority for his commandments. They were set literally in gigantic tablets of stone. It's a pretty good symbol of this. So since there is an understood right and wrong, there is pretty much no leeway in relation to your individual uniqueness. Everyone is under this same law of conduct. And in the course of history, Jewish or otherwise, you could say that these were necessary for that particular time. Like, for example, keeping kosher was probably a good idea for the people that did it in that place and time. It was practical. But for whatever reason, they've become codified as absolute. Everyone should do this. So, again, this old morality there's absoluteness to the rules, and therefore it's inflexible to adaptation to individuals. Nietzsche described this old morality, and it's cognate sort of with the Freudian superego. Nietzsche called this the great dragon that plagues each person in their development. So, this comes from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He wrote, "What is the great dragon, which the spirit is no longer inclined to call Lord and God? Thou shalt is the great dragon called. But the spirit of the lion saith, I will. Thou shalt lieth in its path, sparkling with gold, a scale-covered beast, and on every scale glittereth golden, thou shalt. The values of 1,000 years glitter on those scales, and thus speaketh the mightiest of all dragons. All the values of things glitter on me. All values have already been created, and all created values do I represent. Verily there shall be no I will any more. Thus speaketh the dragon." So in this quotation, the dragon is contrasted with the lion, a symbol of a certain stage of the metamorphosis of one's spirit. It comes from a chapter called The Three Metamorphoses, sometimes translated as Three Metamorphoses of the Spirit. So the lion, as a symbol of discarding these values, corresponds with a discarding of the old morality. Regarding old morality, I found this lovely quotation from Crowley, and he was probably on a lot of cocaine based on how much alliteration is in this. So he wrote, Anthropologists, archaeologists, physicists, and other men of science, risking thumbscrews, stake, infamy, and ostracism, have torn the spider snare of superstition to shreds and broken in pieces the monstrous idol of morality, the murderous Moloch, which has made mankind its meat throughout history. Moral philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology, mental pathology, physiology, and many another of the children of wisdom of whom she is justified well know that the laws of ethics are a chaos of confused conventions, based at best on customs convenient in certain conditions, more often the craft or caprice of the biggest, the most savage, heartless, cunning, and bloodthirsty brutes of the pack, to secure their power or pander to their pleasure in cruelty. So yeah, I just like that quotation. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a slow demise of this conventional view of an absolute law of morals. I think it's epitomized in Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead. The essential realization that had crept in was that we couldn't base moral judgment. In that case, it refers to more than just moral judgment, but we can't base moral judgment on something absolute. And things are becoming relative. Resonant with this, Einstein announced the relativity of space-time itself about half a century later of when Nietzsche said God is dead. So Nietzsche summarized this relativization of morals very succinctly when he wrote, "There is no such thing as moral phenomena, but only moral interpretation of phenomena." So in that sentence, you can see that morality lies in our particular interpretation of phenomena. They don't reside in things themselves. Things in themselves are not good or bad, good or evil. So on the societal level, on the macroscopic scale, Thelema is one of the first religious philosophies to adopt or incorporate this notion of amorality or moral relativism, to be a little more accurate. In the Book of the Law, it says, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." There is no law beyond do what thou wilt. The will being unique to every man and every woman, their laws are essentially not going to be identical. So, aside from other things that it implies, it states each person is to do their own will and not follow out the various laws and mandates from other people. And naturally, moral sanctions imposed from without are discarded. In the microcosm of each individual, the discarding of old morality also occurs on the scale of your lifetime. Each person has to go through the stages of human development, and a large part of all of our development is our approach to our values, our continually changing approach to values, hopefully. In the process of all of our lives, we've adopted many values, and especially during adolescence, we question those values. They're assumed to be true, and eventually we start to realize, hey, maybe that's not the case. And that questioning of values is what Nietzsche spoke of in that segment of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So, stick with Nietzsche for a second. He said there's three metamorphoses of the spirit. There is first the camel that essentially takes on the values of the society it was born into. And this is a necessary stage. It's not an evil or bad stage. Next, through necessity, the lion emerges, which symbolizes discarding these values that we've introjected, meaning that we've taken into ourselves. So, Nietzsche wrote about the lion. He said, "My brethren, wherefore is there need of the lion in the spirit? Why sufficeth not the beast of burden, the camel, which renounceth and is reverent, to create new values that even the lion cannot yet accomplish, but to create itself freedom for new creating, that can the might of the lion do. To create itself freedom and give a holy nay even unto duty. For that, my brethren, there is need of the lion. To assume the right to new values, that is the most formidable assumption for a load-bearing and reverent spirit. Verily, unto such a spirit it is praying and the work of a beast of prey, As its holiest, it once loved thou shalt. Now it's forced to find illusion in arbitrariness, even in the holiest things, that it may capture freedom from its love. The lion is needed for this capture. So, the primary characteristic of this lion-like attitude is to create itself freedom by rejecting the thou shalts and thou shalt nots of the values that were imposed from outside of itself. On the large scale, the macrocosm, old morality is represented to us, the modern individual, in the form of society or the state or the peer group or the family. In the microcosm, it's basically any value we hold on to rigidly. So the lion breaks free from the old perspectives of value, and that includes any values you've acquired through your development. So I'm going to jump over to Rogers, Carl Rogers, whose awesome middle name was Ransom. Carl Rogers was a very influential psychologist. He was one of the founders of the humanistic movement in psychology. He created client-centered therapy, and he was also the president of the American Psychological Association at one point. So he created this system where he delineated the progress of our values throughout our individual development. And the end of this is to become what he calls psychologically mature. And if you want to look up this essay, it's called Toward a Modern Approach to Values. So before getting into that, I have to talk about operative values and conceived values, so bear with me. So operative values are what he says refers to the tendency of any living beings to show preference in their actions for one kind of object or objective rather than another, which need not involve any cognitive or conceptual thinking. And conceived values are the preference of the individual for a symbolized object, where usually in a preference there's anticipation or foresight of the outcome of behavior directed towards such a symbolized object. So that's kind of confusing, but operative values, Rogers gives the example of a worm navigating a maze. It doesn't have to think about this, it just knows, figures it out. When you reject food in preference for another thing, it's not because of this mental conception, you just know this is gross. This is delicious. The infant instinctively turning towards the breast is an operative value. It can't have a symbolic conception of what's going on. It just knows this is good. Even the preference for certain types of music is operative, usually, where it just sounds, it sounds good to you, or it sounds bad. So this is in contrast to conceived values, where it's usually in the form of a symbolic or conceptual statement, like honesty is the best policy, is a conceived value. It requires conception. Never harm anyone. That's a conceived value. Always eat 3 meals per day. Always turn the other cheek. These are all conceived values that require some kind of conception, usually towards some object in the future. You'll get into heaven, or you'll be healthy, or something like that. So Rogers suggests there's various perspectives or stages of values. This first one that goes up here in this weird little box is the infant. According to Rogers, the infant's view of values is inborn. It has, at the outset, a clear approach to values. He prefers some things and experiences and rejects others. We can infer from studying the infant's behavior that he prefers those experiences which maintain, enhance, or actualize his organism, and rejects those which do not serve this end. So, one quality is it's innate. So, infants are inborn with a sense of valuing things, which corresponds to what Rogers calls the actualizing tendency, which is the tendency of all humans, not just infants, to inherently move towards those experiences which maintain, enhance, or actualize the organism, and move away from those that inhibit it. Kind of like the will. The infant's approach is flexible, changing, not a fixed system. What's going on seems best described, this is Rogers, as an organismic valuing process, in which each element, each moment of what he's experiencing is somehow weighed, selected or rejected, depending on whether at this moment it tends to actualize the organism or not. This complicated weighing of experience is clearly organismic and not a conscious or symbolic function. These are operative and not conceived values. So the infant's value system is flexible. It changes with every moment, although there may be consistency in it. And the organismic valuing process is the process whereby we value or judge whether or not things adhere to the actualizing tendency or do not. One of the most important aspects of the infant's approach to values is that the source or locus of the evaluating process is clearly within himself. This is Rogers again. Unlike many of us, he knows what he dislikes and likes, and the origin of these value choices lies strictly within himself. He is the center of the valuing process, the evidence for his choices being supplied by his own senses. The infant doesn't really care what people are saying around him or her. Its own sense of what is right and wrong. And the basis of the infant's system is this organismic valuing process. Everything is weighed based on its potential for helping the actualizing tendency or hindering it. So, in a certain sense, it sounds pretty efficient, and it's a sound process that it's not really worth giving up. But all of us exchange this effective valuing process for something that Rogers says is more rigid, uncertain, and inefficient that characterizes most of us adults. And from Rogers' perspective, the reason we do this is because we want love from our parents or whoever's taking care of us. We want to be accepted and esteemed. He says the infant needs love, wants it, tends to behave in ways which will bring a repetition of this wanted experience. But this brings complications. That's an understatement right there. So, children are scolded for things parents see as unacceptable and rewarded for things viewed as acceptable. And the process by which we take on these values is called the introjection of values. They're outside, and we introject them as opposed to project them. So in this process, Rogers says that the infant has deserted the wisdom of his organism, giving up the locus of evaluation, and is trying to behave in terms of values set by another in order to hold love.
You are listening to
Beach in the Silence.
It's this new stage when the infant starts introjecting values from the outside, which corresponds with Nietzsche's notion of the camel, taking on the values. So the camel is a symbol of the spirit or self that delights in bearing heavy loads. In this case, the burden or weight of introjected values. So Nietzsche says, "What is heavy? So asketh the load-bearing spirit. Then kneeleth it down like the camel, and wanteth to be well laden. What is the heaviest thing, ye heroes? Asketh the load-bearing spirit, that I may take it upon me and rejoice in my strength. All these heaviest things the load-bearing spirit taketh upon itself." So in a way, this stage is in the microcosm what in the macrocosm is old morality. It's this rigid, this is right, that is wrong. And Rogers says, because these introjected concepts are not based on one's own valuing, they tend to be fixed and rigid, rather than fluid and unchanging. It's fixed, has an external locus. So when we're kids and all throughout our lives, we are introjecting values from outside of us as if they're our own. Because they are things, like I mentioned before, always eat 3 meals a day, never hurt anyone. They're fixed. They're conceived values. The problem is that Rogers says is that in this fantastically complex culture of today, the patterns we introject as desirable or undesirable come from a variety of sources and are often highly contradictory in their meanings. So this is more and more the case, I think, as we have the internet, there's TV, and every channel has its own set of values it's trying to put on people. We have peer groups that are constructed of people from all across the world, or even from, outside your little tiny tribe. And the more that we become interconnected, the more contradictory messages we get from different people. This, in general, whatever we introject, however contradictory, Rogers says there's a wide and unrecognized discrepancy between the evidence supplied by our own experience and these conceived values that are introjected. And because our experience no longer dictates our values, as they did when we were infants, the locus or center or source is now outside of us. And because it's outside of us, because these ideas are conceived, they're rigid and fixed, we have to defend them viciously, in a rigid and unchanging way, because the alternative would be a collapse of your values. Yeah, your tower would crumble, so you better dung it about. You want to be part of something, and you want to be like things. And so, if you want to be like, Clint Eastwood or whatever, you'll start taking on his values, even though he can't give you much love because he's Clint Eastwood. So, yeah. But, the more you go on, every single person you meet in every group and every source of someone doing anything is a source of potential values, and we introject them in really haphazard ways. Everyone has contradictory values, whether or not they want to admit it. We'll work with that. So the picture of a huge discrepancy between your own sense of values and what you've basically introjected, Roger says this picture of a big discrepancy is the picture of most of us. So on this discrepancy, Roger says, by taking over the conceptions of others as our own, we lose contact with the potential wisdom of our own functioning and lose confidence in ourselves. Since these value constructs are often sharply at variance with what is going on in our own experiencing, we have in a very basic way divorced ourselves from ourselves. And this accounts for much of modern strain and insecurity. This fundamental discrepancy between the individual's concepts and what he is actually experiencing, between the intellectual structure of his values and the valuing process going on unrecognized within himself. This is a part of the fundamental estrangement of modern man from himself. So at this point in development, this is where we need Nietzsche's lion to create itself or ourselves freedom by discarding these old values of the great dragon, of all these introjected thou shalt and thou shalt nots. So before, as a camel, you take on the values of society and move the center of valuation from within yourself to outside of yourself. And again, this is necessary. We all do it by necessity. So the lion here symbolizes the transition from the psychologically immature to the psychologically mature. So when Roger's talking about this is the picture of us, we're all divorced from ourselves, he also says some individuals are fortunate in developing further in the direction of psychological maturity. And he recommends what he calls the therapeutic climate for this development. And his ideas are so influential that we basically take it for granted. But to him, the therapeutic environment is one of unconditional acceptance and warmth. And this can come from anywhere, but we just don't have it in our society. So to him, that's why we need therapy, is to introduce this environment. A safe, supporting, accepting environment of sorts. So if we're the lion and we discard all of our introjected values, what do we have left? I think this is actually where a lot of Thelemic writing that I've come across and ideas fall short. they stop right here, and they say, discard this, discard that, that is bad, that is, getting in the way of your will. Get rid of that. But what do we fill that with? So once the lion has broken this tablet of values, what do we have? Is do what thou wilt just a call to anarchy and just discarding the old. So I would say no, luckily. So once we discard these introjected values, we actually come upon an approach to values that's very similar to the infant's perspective treated earlier. And Roger says, in this sense, it's fluid, it's flexible. It's based on this particular moment and the degree to which this moment is experienced as enhancing it and actualizing. Values are not held rigidly, but are continually changing. And this return to the fluid and flexible approach to values only happens when we relinquish our attachment to various conceived values, to speak like a Buddhist. The point is that the experience of our organism, the experience of our body, of ourself, is constantly changing. And it becomes more important to what we think is right and wrong than our beliefs about what is right and wrong. Our conceived values structure. So Roger says also in similarity to the infant's perspective, the locus of evaluation is brought firmly within the person again. It's his own experience which provides the value information or feedback. And this doesn't mean you're not open to the evidence you can obtain from other sources, but it means it's taken for what it is. It's outside evidence, and it's not as significant as your own experience or reactions. And he says there's also involved in this valuing process a letting oneself down into the immediacy of what one is experiencing, endeavoring to sense and to clarify all of its complex meanings, just like in infancy. So, amazingly enough, just like Carl Rogers says, this is like the infant's perspective in some ways. Nietzsche designates the stage after the lion as being that of the child. Does that symbol sound familiar?
Yeah.
So of the child, Nietzsche writes in this same very short chapter, by the way, but tell me, my brethren, what can the child do which even the lion could not do? Why hath the preying lion still to become a child? Innocence is the child, and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a holy yea. Aye, for the game of creating, my brethren, there is needed a holy yea unto life. Its own will willeth now the spirit. His own world winneth the world's outcast. So that's a very poetic way of saying things, but they refer to the same ideas. So he says the child is innocence because, in this sense, he doesn't reference his own actions against the values of others, but his own. He's innocent. He doesn't even really care or know what these things are, like a pure fool, so to speak. He's forgetfulness because it's not a fixed system. It's created over and over again. It's fluid and ever-changing. The child is a new beginning and a first movement because the values are renewed in every moment. Each one calls a new judgment from one's self, one's being. And the child is a game because once this occurs, one doesn't take the following of these introjected values so seriously. You'll see people who follow them as kind of stupid. I'm sure we've all had this at some point, where people are following these values and they look like idiots. It's like, why do you even care about that? You're hurting yourself. and actually, Roger says that the infant would laugh at our concern over values if he could even understand it. Nietzsche says this child is a self-rolling wheel because the locus of evaluation is back within oneself. And he is a holy yea because in bringing this locus back into oneself, one naturally becomes more accepting of experience in general. And we're led to affirm experience and the values in the moment that are derived from that. This same image of this mature child is pretty widespread. Some guy once said, "Verily I say unto you, unless ye turn and become as little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." Blavatsky actually said the pupil must regain the child state he has lost. Nietzsche elsewhere says maturity in man. That means having found once again the seriousness which man had as a child in play. This new aeon is the aeon of the crowned and conquering child. Those are just some examples of this symbol being fairly recurrent. So it's a child symbol, but we're adults now. This is the psychologically mature adult. Rogers says that similar to the infant, the psychologically mature adult trusts and uses the wisdom of his organism, with the difference that he is able to do so knowingly. He realizes that if he can trust all of himself, his feelings and his intuitions may be wiser than his mind, that as a total person, he can be more sensitive and accurate than his thoughts alone. I believe this is actually very similar to an idea in Thelema, where reason is not the crown of the individual. He shall fall down into the pit called because. There he shall perish with the dogs of reason. A curse upon because and his kin, yada yada. Also, reason is a lie, because there is a factor infinite and unknown, and all their words are skew-wise. It's the same idea, that your mind is actually not the best source of what you should and should not be doing. In Thelema, it's understood, I believe, that reason should be developed. It's not evil, but it can't be the arbiter, the judge of the will. The reason can only conceive of conceived values. It inherently divorces yourself from your will if you rely solely on it. Reason has to be developed, but it has to stay on its own plane. You use it to deal with the problems and solutions of the mind. If someone said, what is 2 plus 4, you wouldn't tap into your body and say, I don't like that. You would say 6. It's a mental question. I mean, you could do that, but yeah, this question does not actualize my organism. I'm sorry.
Doesn't actualize my orgasm.
Yeah, to each his own. Basically, reason has to be a minister to the will, not a master. It's a cruel master, but a good servant. Basically, this child or the psychologically mature individual is getting back in touch with this organismic valuing process. Organismic is Roger's word for the body, but not just the body, the organism as a whole. Rogers basically says this is the solution to what can guide our actions once we discard all these conceived values and we discard reason as the sole arbiter. It fills the vacuum of our questioning and discarding as a lion. Rogers said that there is an organismic base for an organized valuing process within the human individual. It's part of the functioning life process of any healthy organism. It's the capacity for receiving feedback information which enables the organism continually to adjust its behavior and reactions so as to achieve the maximum possible self-enhancement. Which is a very academic way to say your body knows best. Your whole organism. It will naturally strive for self-enhancement. So we're all born with this. It's inborn, but it's covered over by these conceived values in our need for love and esteem. And as we begin to question and discard these values that are imposed from without, we basically re-adopt many of these same facets here. The difference being that we have the psychological maturity and insight of an adult. We don't discard our knowledge. It's still there. We know, for example, that a stove may be warm and your body wants to go towards it, but in this case you probably shouldn't touch it. So this is kind of a tangent, but I think it actually is relevant to Thelema, what Rogers is saying, in that some people say relocating our valuing process to within ourselves will result in widespread anarchy. Has anyone ever heard this or thought this about everyone doing their own will? So Rogers says that although the process of this organismic valuing process is unique to each individual, to each organism, the values are actually, they have a large degree of commonality across humanity. So he says, where individuals are valued, where there's greater freedom to feel and to be, certain value directions seem to emerge. These are not chaotic directions, but instead have a surprising commonality. This commonality does not seem to be due to the influences of any one culture. I like to think that this commonality of value directions is due to the fact that we all belong to the same species. As a species, there may be certain elements of experience which tend to make for inner development, and which would be chosen by all individuals if they were genuinely free to choose. So he calls these value directions of what people tend towards once they re-access this organismic valuing process. And he has a list of them. Tell me if these sound good to you. So he said, these people tend to move away from facades, pretense, defensiveness, putting up a front. They tend to move away from oughts or shoulds. They tend to move away from meeting the expectations of others. Being real is positively valued. Self-direction is positively valued. Oneself, one's own feelings become positively valued. Being a process as opposed to being fixed is positively valued. Perhaps more than all else, the individual comes to value an openness to all of his inner and outer experience. There's also sensitivity to others and acceptance of others being positively valued, and deep relationships are positively valued. That all sounds very nice. Yay. That being said, although there are general trends of value directions, it's recognized in Thelema that there is no law beyond do what thou wilt. So, in no way is this saying you should be in deep relationships and be open to all of your inner and outer experience. That's up to you to decide. So instead of dogmatically imitating these common stances on values, which would amount to basically introjecting new conceived values, we can basically recognize that the very fact of a possible commonality of value directions among men who are free and esteemed, as he says, shows us this process doesn't need to end, at least, in complete anarchy. In a way, we all want very similar things, at least.
Visit speechinthesilence.com for future programs, news, music, and more.
So, in the context of this, we haven't brought up kind of the obvious will versus want thing, which I think is, which I think is first and foremost in Thelema. So, seeing as we all know, it's do what thou wilt and not do what thou want. How do we avoid enforcing what seems to be a necessary conceived value of needing to each person needing to discover their true will? Or should it be avoided?
So I heard you saying, how do we avoid this conceived value of everyone should do their true will,
or needs to discover it first?
Yeah. And is there a separate question of will versus want?
Well, there is. Well, I should think that it's pretty obvious that there is.
Yeah.
But it seems like it can see its value in and of itself, that there's a such thing as will versus want. Mm-hmm. So in order for the whole system to work, that needs to be, it seems to be a necessary postulate.
Yeah. Well, I would say two things. First of all, everyone needs to do their true will is, in a way, a little different than other conceived values, because it is a conceived value. But what that's saying is everyone should come to their own sense of what their law is. Basically, it's saying everyone should mature into a psychologically mature person using this model. It's basically, there's one absolute, which is there's no absolutes, that kind of thing. There is no law beyond do what thou wilt. So everyone do your will, but I'm not going to tell you what that is, because you have to figure that out. For want and will, I think that's actually a pretty complex topic in a lot of ways. I would say that your wants a lot of times stem from conceived values, but not necessarily. They can stem from just bodily desires that aren't necessarily in accord with your will. And in a way, that's the part where the mind comes in, and you say you have this instinct to, I want to shoot up, but then say, but really, what I really want is to be healthy, therefore don't shoot up. I want to be active, therefore don't do this. That's why I kind of chafed at the instinct part of it, because it's a little more than instinct. It's kind of, when you check in with this, so to speak, there's a felt sense of what is right and wrong, and that's more than just a temporary, oh my God, I really need to watch TV right now, or something like that. In a way, there's kind of veils, there's the veil of reason, of the thoughts that are going on, and there's the veil of the emotions, anger or fear, and then there's also the veil of these impulses or urges, and underneath that there is this organismic valuing process, which in a way knows that it's right or wrong. This is actually what I think is a way to look at the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, notion of the higher power that you tap into. You know that this is best for you, even though your urges are telling you to drink or to use. But there is part of you that knows you should be doing something else, or else you wouldn't be there, or the court mandated you to be there. So, recap. So there's this old morality, the fixed and absolute rules of conduct, which is this great dragon. There's Roger's system here, where there's the infant that has the inborn organismic valuing process that's continually changing, but through the desire for love and esteem, we introject these values. That's the notion of the camel on Nietzsche's side, that bears the burden of its society's values. And it creates a dissonance in ourselves because of the gap between our experience and our thought processes about what we should and shouldn't be doing, our conceived values, which is psychologically immature. And then we begin to question our values. Many of them seem arbitrary, useless, or irrelevant, which corresponds to the lion that gives a holy nay even unto duty. And you can see that this process is kind of infant, youth, adolescence, adult, even though it's not a one-way street. It occurs over and over again. So during this talk, you're going to hear me say things, and you may introject the value of those things, and then you may decide, well, I like that part, but not that part, and then you'll come to your own understanding, hopefully. So this process does not just happen once. And in a way, this is very similar to another process that occurs, which shows that it's cyclical or constantly happening in various ways. You have the I, which in this case may be a thesis, taking on something. This is what is. And then A, the antithesis, the destruction. No, this sucks. And then here you have a synthesis of, okay, I'm going to figure out, based on that, what is actually good. So once we get past this stage, we have the possibility of entering into this psychologically mature state where we bring this locus back within ourselves and we rely on our own experience. We become as little children, relinquishing attachment to these conceived static values. And this is the child of Nietzsche. Basically, we are trying to make room. We're trying to make room for this child. We are saying that Christianity or that secular humanism or whatever that I grew up with is not for me, or even this part of Thelema is not for me. What takes the place of that is not another value that just comes in from another place. Well, actually, that is what usually takes the place of that, is something else. But the move to psychological maturity in this map, at least, comes when you get back in touch with the organismic valuing process that we've had inherently since our birth, and is still there, and we still access it at various times. It's just been clouded over. It's like a star that has clouds covering it, and just need to clear it away and let that be. So, any star that would want to shine brightly would do well to disperse those clouds. And anyone who tries to actualize their full potential as a human being will and does engage in this re-examination of values. We've all done it. I doubt any of us would be here if we hadn't done that to some extent. So this is a quote from Rogers that's I thought was interesting. He said, instead of universal values out there, or a universal value system imposed by some group, philosophers, or rulers, or priests, we have the possibility of universal value directions emerging from the experiencing of each human organism. And he says that evidence from therapy indicates that both personal and social values emerge as natural and experienced when the individual is close to his own organismic valuing process. The suggestion is that though modern man no longer trusts religion or science or philosophy or any system of beliefs to give him his values, he may find an organismic valuing base within himself, which, if he can learn again to be in touch with it, will prove to be organized, adaptive, and even social approach to the perplexing value issues which face all of us. There's hope. So in short, we have to re-access the wisdom of the body. The organismic valuing process, as Rogers called it. And this wisdom of the body, as I'm going to call it, it's a term. We don't have a word for what I'm talking about. Hence the creation of a term. And wisdom of the body. It's beyond, like I said, it's beyond reason and it's beyond emotion. So Crowley has this nice quote where he says, reason and emotion, these are the two great enemies of the ethic of Thelema. They are the traditional obstacles to success in yoga as well as in magic. That coheres nicely with the point I'm trying to make.
What if I want to save the whale?
So, interestingly enough, Nietzsche, about 3 chapters later, says something very similar to this. He says, the awakened one, the knowing one, saith, body am I entirely, and nothing more. For soul or mind is only the name of something in the body. The body is a big wisdom, a plurality with one sense, a war and a peace, a flock and a shepherd. An instrument of thy body is also thy little wisdom, my brother, which thou callest mind, a little instrument and plaything of thy big wisdom. I, or ego, sayest thou, and art proud of that word. But the greater thing, in which thou art unwilling to believe, is thy body, with its big wisdom. It saith not I, but doeth it. What the sense feeleth, what the mind discerneth, hath never its end in itself. But sense and mind would fain persuade thee that they are the end of all things, so vain are they. Instruments and playthings are sense and spirit. Behind them there is still the self. The self seeketh with the eyes of the senses. It hearkeneth also with the ears of the mind. Ever hearkeneth the self, and seeketh. It compareth, mastereth, conquereth, and destroyeth. It ruleth, and is also the ego's ruler. Behind thy thoughts and feelings, my brother, there is a mighty Lord, an unknown sage. It is called self. It dwelleth in thy body. It is thy body. There is more wisdom in thy body than in thy best wisdom.
Thank you, Brother IAO131, for that interesting talk.